Peter Smagorinsky is a distinguished research professor emeritus in the Department of Language and Literary Education at the University of Georgia, and a distinguished visiting scholar at the Universidad de Guadalajara, Mexico. His research focuses on literacy, teacher education, and mental health, often examining these topics through a sociocultural lens influenced by Vygotsky. During his tenure at the University of Georgia, he served as a faculty advisor for the Journal of Language and Literacy Education from 2012 to 2020, mentoring numerous scholars in the field. His scholarship has led to several influential publications, including Learning to Teach English and Language Arts, a Vygotskian perspective on beginning teachers' pedagogical concept development, and Developing Culturally and Historical Sensitive Teacher Education, co-edited with Yolanda Gayol and Patricia Rosas. Smagorinsky examines how literacy is taught and learned in schools, as well as how teacher education can better support diverse learners. His recent work focuses on neurodiversity in education, co-editing creativity and community among autism spectrum youth, and dismantling the disabling environment of education. His research continues to shed discussions on literacy instruction, inclusive education, and teacher development worldwide, contributing to the advancement of equitable and effective teaching practices. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody. And I'd like to extend my own personal welcome to everyone, in addition to the organizing committee's welcome. Of course, it's a very great honor to be able to give the opening talk, and I hope it's time well spent. I just want to review a little bit about my presentation style. I don't use technology, so you won't have to worry about the PowerPoint. So the only thing I have to project is words. I hope that that's acceptable. And my words are unfortunately only in English, and thank you so much for tolerating both my English language limitations and my American citizenship these days. I'm also going to rely, I'm glad you laughed at that. It's difficult. So I'm going to rely on a written text. So in preparation for this, I actually wrote 3 different papers. The first one that I wrote, I realized wasn't Vygotskian enough for this role at the conference, and so I sent that to a journal, and then I wrote this one, and this one's actually quite long, and unless you want to cancel the next session, I have to give an abbreviated form of this paper, and so this is really about 1/3 of what I wrote in extended form. And at times, I've rehearsed this a few times, and it seems to me a little choppy sometimes because I chopped out large sections of it. And the other, so I'm going to use the script because I don't want to lose track of the points, but I also find that, at least for me, the most interesting parts are when I'm not on script, when I go off script. And that's what I enjoy. Actually, my preferred style is entirely interactive, where I ask you to help me talk about what interests you. So here we go. I probably, what I found too is that even though this is only about 1/3 of the whole paper, it probably would extend the time that I've been allotted. So I may not finish the paper, which is okay. So I came on this topic, I was reviewing some things that I'd written before to help me think about what I might say today. And I realized with all this rereading that I'd missed some very interesting connections that I think are worth giving more thought to. This talk that I've come up with, I think does a better job than I've done before of explaining Vygotsky's deep interest in the process of culturally mediated long-term human development with special attention. And before I go on, I'm going to make some points here. If you're not doing long-term human development, you're not doing Vygotsky. And I'll return to that point a little later, but that's what he was about. not short-term learning through particular instructional methods. Okay, and so I'm going to give special attention to two areas that I hadn't really recognized before as being so similar that they involve a developmental continuum. Play and games in early development, and school and childhood in adolescence. I now see these as two related forms of mediation that comprise a single sort of experience: play and games, school, and ultimately cultural labor. That's what in Vygotsky's writing. Now, keep in mind, I'm trying to talk about what Vygotsky said, not what I think, even though I'm often aligned with what he says. But I think we also have to critique what he wrote from a different perspective we have at this time in history and from our different national positions, cultural positions. So I see these as related forms of mediation that comprise a single sort of experience, one that's designed to socialize children and youth to a cultural and national identity, which for Vygotsky was centered on the collective labor in service of developing the new Soviet man. This is not really part of what we get about Vygotsky in writing the claims of Vygotskian perspective. That he was really, he was talking about how people become socialized to be members of a culture, and at his time, and he arrived in Moscow right around the time of the October Revolution, or right in the formative period of the Soviet Union. Developing the new Soviet man in a hurry was a big part of what surrounded him, and therefore became a big part of what he talked about. So I think it's worth, in terms of how Vygotsky is taken up today, I decided to look up citations to Vygotsky's writing. And you don't get the exact same numbers with different types of searches, but I think that this is a good rough estimate, even though it goes up by the week, right? You always see Vygotsky reference, so these counts are always going up, but I think the ratios and proportions are probably about the same. So Vygotsky's, what's really so astonishing, I think, so he's been referenced about 366,000 times in scholarly writing, which is a whole lot. I looked up, just for comparative purposes, I looked up John Dewey, who was in the mid 400,000s, but he lived into his 90s. And he wrote for a much more kind of citation-ready readership. So it's extraordinary, 366,000 references to Vygotsky, and this citational authority has been accumulated many decades after his entire field was banned in the Soviet pedology degree of 1936. You couldn't read these people. They didn't all survive this. So of these 366,000, about 3/4 of them go to two publications. One is the 3 different translations of Thought and Language or Thinking and Speech, depending on which versions you look at. And of those, this really surprised me, about 60,000 go to the very first one, 1962, which is regarded by everybody I know who speaks Russian as the least reliable version of this volume. And about 13,000 going to the other two, 1986 and 1987. So that's about 73,000 references to this one volume. We should all be so lucky with our own work. In addition to that, over 200,000 of the citations go to the greatest hits collection, Mind and Society, plus thousands more references to individual chapters in the volume that are selectively removed from the context of his broader writing, and that's the big problem. It's not so much I have a problem with Mind and Society, but I have a real problem with how it's been taken up. Basically 2 chapters out of context. And I'm going to deal with the one on play as part of this talk. So I think it's wise when reading secondary sources, that is, people who reference references, and beyond, to keep in mind that about 260 of his 366,000 citations go to the least faithful translation of thought and language, and the out-of-context chapters in Mind and Society. Come to believe that most of these citations are not based on actual reading, but instead are a consequence of the ways in which Vygotsky has become a meme, used to substantiate either vague or meaningless claims like learning is social, Vygotsky, 1978. It means nothing, right? But I don't know how many times I've seen this. Learning is social, Vygotsky. Or to attribute to Vygotsky, ideas he never expressed, especially instructional scaffolding. There is nothing in Vygotsky about scaffolding, except when he talks about toddlers learning to walk and holding onto a piece of furniture. But the piece of furniture was not deliberately placed there by a teacher to help him get to the next stage of walking. It's what the toddler just sort of, grabs onto. Trying to stand up. We've all done that, right? We've all been scaffolded in that way. But as a meme, Vygotsky positions the writer of new texts as associated with a famous name, no matter how far off the author is from Vygotsky's Soviet context. And contextualizing Vygotsky in the formation of the Soviet Union is very important. Sometimes I wonder if he really believed what he said. There are those who believe that his writing was revised by agents of the state to bring it more in line with Stalinist Marxism. So taking him up now and here, and by here I mean wherever we're from. Are there any Russians here? Okay, the two of you are really going to like this. No, the three of you. I can't see how many. At any rate, and it may be that maybe my complaints come from the way he's taken up in the United States, but typically what I've learned from students is that they took an ed psych course, and Vygotsky is the zone of proximal development and scaffolding. And this might be a good time to critique this translation of the zone of proximal development. My next door neighbor is an autism researcher at Georgia State University. And we were talking one day and he said, well, what are you up to? And I said, when I was working on the book for IFTI, I said, I'm working on this book on a Russian guy named Vygotsky. Actually, he's not Russian. He was from Belarus. In fact, he's from the same town as my grandparents, Gomel. I don't think they knew each other. The times don't fit. At any rate, my grandparents fled the Romanovs, and that's a really fascinating story in itself, but we don't have all day on that. Where was I on that? Okay, anyhow, I'm old enough that I can't remember what I was saying a minute ago. When I was watching the dancers up here, I was thinking, if that were a bunch of people my age, they couldn't remember all the steps, and they'd probably knock each other out with the batons in short order. So good. That's something for youth. Oh, but my neighbor Brian, he said, "Oh, Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development, right?" I said, "Well, sort of." Because that's what we've received, the zone of proximal development. I was talking to a younger scholar just last week, and she brought up the zone of proximal development, and I asked her to define each term. What do these three things mean? And I think proximal. What the heck? And she had a hard time doing it, and I think most people would have trouble if they just broke it down. What does zone, proximal, and develop mean, and then what do they mean collectively? And I think that its kind of vagueness, at least to American ears, enables it to be interpreted however someone wants to interpret it. So I was never satisfied with early on, it was like 30 years ago, I became dissatisfied with all this ZPD stuff. And in about 15 or 20 years ago, I finally read his volume on defectology. If you're not familiar with defectology, first of all, I put off reading it for about 15 years because I hated the title. Why is this guy writing about defective people? Turns out it's one of those terms that is the opposite of what the body of work actually is. It's incredibly sensitive. It's sensitive to the environments that we build around people who are different. And in the Soviet Union, there was constant war for 10 or 15 years. World War I, Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Civil War, a lot of children were damaged and ended up deaf, blind, and cognitively impaired from explosives. So the task of the new Soviet Union was to educate them somehow. So there was there are these schools of defectology. And there was a documentary by the BBC, I think it came out in 1990, it's called The Butterflies of Zagorsk. Zagorsk is a Russian city. It now goes by a different name, and I forget what it is. But the narrator, so what they did, there were these kids who couldn't hear or see, I think. And they were all taught how to, and they didn't know the alphabet. And I don't know the Russian alphabet. So they were taught to create, like basically spell on one another's hands. So they had to learn an alphabet first, and they could then communicate. They couldn't talk. They couldn't see, and they couldn't hear, but they could do this. And so this was, you can imagine, this is a very laborious process. It took months and months and months. And the narrator said, and this is the zone of next development. And I went, bingo, that's it. Get this proximal out of there. It's not what you learn today and do tomorrow. Those are metaphors. The buds and flowers metaphor that he uses, that's a season-long process. It's not today and tomorrow, which is what scaffolding is. So the zone of next development, it just made so much more sense to me in light of Vygotsky's developmental emphasis. And then more recently, there's a pair of translators, David Kellogg, who's an American expat in South Korea, and Nikolai Verasov, who's a Russian expat in Australia, at Monash University. They've been working on new translations of previously translated work. And this speaks to a deep dissatisfaction among many for the quality of the translations we've inherited. And they made another slight change, not the zone of next development, but the next zone of development, which to me captures much more robustly the idea that human development in these kind of stages, not Piagetian stages, they're age-based, but in cultural maturation, that's what Vygotsky was talking about. And I'll return to this scaffolding problem a little bit later, but I hope that gives you an understanding of why I believe that he never had anything to do with what he's most widely credited for, and probably would reject it as being dependent on him. So Vygotsky never worked at the level of lesson design, but he's often invoked as the architect of instructional scaffolding, which is actually Jerome Bruner's adaptation based on his reading of the most questionable of the translations, the 1962 translation of Thought and Language, which is better translated as Thinking and Speech, according to my friends out there. So if Vygotsky was concerned with long-term human development and not short-term teaching and learning, and if Vygotsky never mentioned the instructional technique for which he is now so often credited, of what value is he? I think we need to think about that. Why do we have this meme that keeps getting handed around attached to meaningless sayings like learning is social when you don't need Vygotsky for that? So I'm going to talk about two areas that I play and games and schooling that I see as related facets of a long developmental continuum lead to participation in cultural labor. And in Soviet society, there were restricted forms of labor for people. These two areas were so well related, they often appear to be the same phenomenon. Playing games and schooling have remarkable similarities as described by Vygotsky in the Soviet context. Even as in the popular mind, they're seen by many to be quite different and perhaps even in opposition. So I'm going to review those things and we'll see what happens. We'll see if I ever get to the end. I'm almost halfway through my time here and I'm on page 3. But that's good, I think, unless you really want to hear the end. And somebody, by the way, I know that I'm supposed to go for about 45 minutes and then do questions. So I'm going to rely, are you all going to time keep me or wave or blow the whistle at a quarter after? You'll wave, and I'll wave back and then keep going, okay? All right, so play. If you grow up in America, maybe Europe too, you think of play as just, running around and having fun. So it's often contrasted with work or labor, one being fun and the other being serious. But to Vygotsky, play was very serious work, and work is the cultural product of play. He referenced Stern's concept of Ernstspiel, and which is a German term, I hope I didn't botch it too much. Ernstspiel, which is serious play. What matters most in his Marxist outline is the role of play in one's socialization to cultural norms, especially the collective human labor of Soviet society, which provided him with the culture within which he generated his views on human development. I think that making him and I'm speaking as an American, making him an American now is trickier than it appears. You just can't take his writing and then act as though it can easily transfer. Another little break from the text. Early in my effort to understand these things, probably 30, 35 years ago. In fact, it was probably about the year 2000, what year would that be? About 1990. Keep in mind, that was right at the end of the Ronald Reagan administration in America and at the beginning or middle probably of the first George Bush's presidential administration, which was a retrenchment into an old conservative view of economics. And Louis Small, who's a guy I have a lot of respect for, was speaking at AERA, and he said, why is Vygotsky getting popular now, in the midst of Reaganism? How is Vygotsky emerging as this darling of the conference? I think that's a good question to ask now. At least in the United States, under Trump, how is Vygotsky, this old Soviet, getting revived, continuing to kind of grow in authority? I think that's a good question to ask. So to Vygotsky, play involves the creation of imaginary situations. Culture provides developmental boundaries, giving play a different orientation in Marxist and bourgeois societies, even though the broad processes might be similar. The Soviet Union had the initial task, and again, I think you have to situate him in where he was. In fact, the book that I did for IFTI, what I really was trying to understand is, who is this guy, and how did he get that way? And so I'm trying to historicize his career by looking at his Soviet context. The Soviet Union had the initial task of incorporating many different cultures into a monocultural nation, rapidly and often by force. You might have heard of all the dead Ukrainians in the 30s as a result of Stalin. And when I critique the Soviet Union, especially the Stalinist era, it's disquieting to think of how similar the United States is right now. It's very unnerving to wonder how we're actually very much different. So cultural contours were thus quite important to the Soviet Union, to the Soviets, as they are for any country that aspires to have a national identity. And this is something I've written about in the last few years. In the United States, the mass education movement came in the mid-1800s when we had a huge European immigration wave. And a man named Horace Mann is credited with the leadership of a mass education movement that was designed less to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, and more to teach how to be an American as defined by Americans with authority. So the purpose of schooling in the United States initially, and I would say through today, is assimilation to dominant culture norms. That's why we have school. And that was also why the Soviets had school, to take all these, what a giant country, like 12, 13 time zones, and they had to incorporate everyone into a Soviet mindset. And it was the first Marxist experiment in a national culture. And it was a little uneven, shall we say. So these contours promote monoculturalism. Again, this is what we're seeing in the United States right now. And I don't know all the different European nations well enough to say how widespread this phenomenon is. So in this monocultural emphasis of schooling is very troubling to multiculturalists who reject the goal of assimilation that's baked into mass public education. So, and I'd be interested in hearing from people from other parts of the world. Is this just us, or is it everywhere? By us, I mean the US. So through play, children and youth learn how to act in socially acceptable ways. You play within the rules of the game. It's always serious work with a developmental thrust. Ultimately, through play, people develop ways to regulate their thinking and actions within the expectations of social roles and rules, growing into the society as much as into their own personality. And I'm not sure I really saw that until I worked on this paper. Play thus becomes a fundamental means of growth into a social being containing, and I'll quote, all the developmental tendencies in a condensed form. In play, it is as though the child were trying to jump above the level of its normal behavior and into the socialized behavior cultivated by society. And if you've read a lot of Soviet history, you know that you just didn't have a lot of options. I'm worried about that in the US again today. This developmental acclimation to social standards, however gradual, comes within the disciplinary bounds set by rules, conventions, and other forms of control. So there was actually a lot of restriction. There were limits. And I'm not sure that people who reference Vygotsky today see him as one who was concerned with socialization into a national culture. He said, in play, the child is free, but this is an illusory freedom because cultural guidelines limit what's possible. So here's another area that gets overlooked, and that's the role of obstacles in play and schooling. I may never get to the schooling part of this talk. In addition to rules and boundaries, play typically requires engagement with obstacles, without which human growth is not possible. He wrote, if you would like a child to do something well, take care to place obstacles in his path. His Marxist orientation was founded in dialectical materialism, a formulation through which a thesis engages with an antithesis, requiring a synthesis to resolve the opposition, benefiting both the thinker and what is being thought about. And I think that this dialectical aspect of his work in the United States gets overlooked, maybe because it's Marxist. And if you're not aware of this, Marxism bad. Socialism bad. We just had our mayoral race in my city of Athens, and one of the candidates was accused of being a socialist, and he lost. Because as we know, it's horrible. And I grew up in the 50s and 60s. The scariest thing in the world was communists, even though we never saw them. But commies, I lived outside Washington, D.C., and every day at noon, an air raid siren would go off. We'd test the air raid siren at noon, and every day at noon I thought I was going to die. And it was kind of a terrifying thing. And I was in the generation we used to hide under the desks because that would save you from a nuclear explosion. Apparently. Okay. So, without obstacles, no development. The obstacle-infused competition of games to Vygotsky has particular salience in promoting development, in contrast with modern-day beliefs that collaboration and cooperation serve as ideal means of being educated. Smooth routes lack a set of obstacles to overcome in the process of maturation, providing children with few tools for navigating difficulty on their own. An overabundance of obstacles does not serve development well. But without them, no development, says Vygotsky. And this was really striking to me because so much education is designed to make things easier, not harder. And so if you say you're Vygotskian, where do you fall on that question? I don't think you can be selectively Vygotskian. And this is a criticism. I know Courtney Caston wrote about this, I think, in the 80s on selective readings of Vygotsky. I think, if anything, they've gotten more selective. And again, maybe I'm speaking only of what I read in English in the United States. So, if play is a future-oriented developmental form of action, toward what is it directed? That depends on which culture provides the setting for children's development. Anyone who occupied Lenin's, then Stalin's Soviet Union had little wiggle room on what sort of social future a developing child could look forward to. The ultimate destination for Soviets was collective labor on rural farms or urban factories. And I find this interesting because of their claims to leveling social classes in the Soviet Union. From what I can tell, and this may be a very crude generalization, that there were 4 classes of people. At the top were the leaders, and they seemed to live a pretty good life, right? Nice, fine Cuban cigars, brandy, blah, 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 blah. And so they were the top tier, the leaders in the Kremlin. Then there were 2 working classes that had different status. Urban industrial workers were more highly prized, I think, and it had to do with their, I guess, the sophistication of their possibilities. And then agricultural farm workers. They were supposedly the same, but they weren't really. And there was a 4th, much reviled social class, and that's us, the intelligentsia. This was referred to as, by Lenin, and the intelligentsia was referred to by Lenin as society's shit. And I look around the United States, I think, oh, that's here too, at least according to my president and his people. And I'm telling you, the parallels between Trumpist America and Stalinist Soviet Union are alarming. And maybe it's because I grew up fearing that society. Through our own propaganda, but they also didn't play nice. So Vygotsky saw a play leading to the world of collective labor. This is what we were headed for. That's what we were socialized to. With schooling a key medium of development, play and labor are thus part of a developmental continuum separated by Vygotsky as tasks of different stages, next zones of development, but also serving as a sequence fundamental to maturation into a society's ways and means. Learning to play by rules, and he said, this is a quote, teaches the child to steer his behavior and master it within guardrails available from collective parameters. These boundaries provide the direction for socialization, which is advanced by the child's self-regulation in relation to them. Play becomes disciplined according to the developmental channels and destinations available in a society. This is a form of regulation that conforms one's actions to the roles and rules available within a social collective. You got to play by the rules. Now, one thing that I think, let me see if I get to that. Developmentally and dialectically, he argued, play and labor do not stand in contrast, instead serving as sequential stages in a long-term process of development. So he undertook what he considered to be a Marxist analyst societies with special attention to the distinction between the decadent, bourgeois, capitalist Western cultures, like mine, and the world's first Marxist experiment in the new Soviet Union, free from class differences and brimming with equality until the midnight knock at the door indicated otherwise. To Vygotsky, and to me, this may trouble some of you. It is impossible, he said, to be a Marxist in a bourgeois society. Can't happen. Which perhaps explains two things. One is why so many United States Marxist professors charge such high fees to visit your campus and rail against the evils of capitalism. We had a guy, my students wanted to invite a well-known Marxist, and he said, if I fly in and out on one day, that's $5,000. If I come for 3 days, that's $15,000. To come and tell us about how capitalism is so bad. They declined and went to Plan B. And there's another thing that this helps explain. Again, you can't be a Marxist in a bourgeois society. There are people who claim to be Vygotskian because they talk about scaffolding, and boy, do they make a lot of money doing it. Either speakers' fees, in-servicing, and book sales. So there are some real conundrums that I think we have to face if you're going to do more than have a meme and just say Vygotsky and move along to whatever you want to do. You have to pay attention to what he said about you. These were people he called popularizers, and he had very, very negative things to say about the popularizers. And that's really to the second category, not the Marxist professors. So Vygotsky argued that play becomes subject to self-regulation through the use of verbal signs. And I'm going to quote René van der Veer, and René's one of the people who's been very, very helpful to me, very generous with me in helping me understand things that I'm not clear on. It probably helps if you can read Vygotsky in at least 5 languages. And he's Dutch. He translates Russian into English, and for one of the volumes of the collected works that he translated, he said, I read the German and French versions to verify my translation. I'm thinking, good night. This guy is on the ball. And that's all I know. He may have more than 5 languages, and I know that's more typical of Europeans, and I appreciate all the Europeans who are allowing English to be the language here. So his play becomes subject to self-regulation through the use of verbal signs. words become the central means of self-regulation, especially after their appropriation as inner speech, the verbal thinking undertaken privately as a stage toward public articulation. Play becomes subject to self-regulation through the use of verbal signs that help children orient themselves conceptually to cultural systems of thought through which governing rules emerge. And this may be very troubling if you're I got 5 minutes? Okay. This may be troubling if you claim that you're a multimodalist in the Vygotskian tradition, because I don't think there is one. One of the things I think I took out of here was I taught a doctoral seminar in Vygotsky a few years ago. And at the end, on the course evaluation, one of the students said, the main problem with this course is we didn't do any Vygotskian lesson plans. And I thought, that's because there aren't any. So, games. Games are preparation for cultural life. Actually, I'm going to, interesting things here. He was very critical. There are some things he was very critical of. Christians and Western socialization that produce social hierarchies. Sometimes I think, what was it like to be him then in the 20s and 30s? He arrived in Moscow just when Hitler was coming to power. And he was not a nice guy, Hitler. You familiar with this? There was a game, speaking of games, there was a game called Jews Out that Nazi children were taught. And the purpose of the game was to collect Jews and put them outside the walls. In America, by the way, the kind of paradigmatic game is Monopoly, where you take everybody's stuff and crush them economically. This is who we are as a people. And I think he could never imagine games like Grand Theft Auto, right? His audience talking. There was a case in the United States. An 8-year-old boy played Grand Theft Auto and afterwards killed his 88-year-old caretaker. So this might raise the question, well, maybe he's wrong about that, or maybe he was right in that today's games produce tomorrow's citizens. You might have heard we have a little gun violence problem in the United States. So I'll do one quick more thing. Okay, I'll just finish up the gaming part and I won't get to the schooling part, which is all right. To Vygotsky, learning to play games has a strongly moral dimension. People need to feel the moral understandings they reach in deep psychological ways. He was very vague on what he meant by morality, ethics, virtue, or character. He appeared to assume that games have an inherently moral or virtuous design, and that by learning how to play within their contours, children develop a moral code that in turn can be applied to new situations. His belief in the superiority of Soviet culture, which I think was very sincere, especially if you grew up in Gomel during the Romanov era, and they were subject to pogroms. They were attacked. They were murdered, and the Soviet Union undoubtedly offered a promise that was inspiring at the outset. And so its ideals were very powerful. So he believed in the superiority of Soviet culture as providing the moral compass guiding the Soviets' thought. So if morality is always ideological and local, which is something I've argued separate from Vygotsky, then morality might be considered the frame of mind and action that best serves a society's interests. And what this kind of the uncomfortable conclusion that I've reached from doing all this is that he was promoting one's socialization to a national cultural set of norms. He wasn't challenging them. He conceived of the USSR as a moral nation and its citizens' adherence to doctrine in support of the new Soviet man as a moral life arc. He also said it is impossible to be moral in a capitalist society. They're inherently immoral. whereas we, the Soviets, are inherently moral. And I think that a lot of nations, including my own, take that perspective. We're okay, it's you guys out there. So it all begins with playing games and becomes a matter of virtuous citizenship throughout the process of maturation. Process is realized in the conduct of national mass schooling, which I argue in the second half of this is so similar. Obstacles, morality, socialization toward collective labor in adulthood.